Welcome back. Last time we were thinking about some of the examples that we have in the Bible that can help shape the way that we approach our work. In this video, what I want us to look at is some of the attitudes that the Bible seems to cultivate. And there are many places we could go to, but let me highlight just three things. The first I want to call passion and enthusiasm. In Romans chapter 12 in the New Testament, this is a wonderfully positive chapter. But go and read it again while thinking about the work that you do. Verse 11, for example, in Romans 12 says, "Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord." One writer said that because of God's mercy already shown to us, this verse 11 literally means keep yourself on the boil. Paul is obviously not calling for us to be rushing around aimlessly, but he is calling us to cultivate enthusiasm and positivity in our work. The author Tim Keller comments on this idea from this chapter. Instead of working out of false passion, which is born of selfishness, you are working out of true passion, which is born of selflessness. You are adopted into God's family, so you already have your affirmation. You are justified in God's sight, so you have nothing to prove. You've been saved through a dying sacrifice, so you are free to be a living one. You are loved ceaselessly, so you can work tirelessly in response to a quiet inner fullness. A second set of attitudes would be in the area of contentment and joy. We could go to Philippians chapter 4 and verses 4 to 20. Again, read these verses too and think about how they might apply to work. Contentment is so rare in this world. We do love to grumble and complain and stress and worry, don't we? But there's such a note of gladness and positivity in these verses that lifts our perspective. It reminds us of God's fatherly care and his near presence with us and helps us to stay calm and thankful. And then thirdly, what about the idea of sincerity and fairness? I think under this idea, we could go somewhere like Ephesians chapter 6 and verses 5 to 9. I'm conscious that this particular passage speaks about slaves and masters, so a quick word about that. The first century was obviously a very different Roman Empire economy, and the idea of slavery was common. By the time the New Testament is written, I'm told that in the Roman Empire, there were as many as 60 million slaves across the empire. And these slaves are not like what we might call the dregs of society. They included doctors and teachers and musicians and actors and secretaries. And wages and conditions could vary from being appalling to excellent. We've got to be very careful when we come to the Bible to recognize that the Bible never condones the concept of slavery. But at the same time, the New Testament wasn't written as a political document to correct the prevailing cultural norms of the Roman Empire. What Paul is far more concerned about is people's heart attitudes and showing how believers should live within such an existing culture. I think the impact for us is that if Paul is concerned about the hearts of slaves and their masters, then these attitudes that he talks about are not less relevant to us who live in a culture with much better working conditions. But in the end, what Paul underlines is sincerity and hard work. Paul ultimately says that when we do our work, we actually do it as Christians with an audience of one, Christ himself. This means that we work the same when our boss is watching and when they aren't, because in the end, we're not trying to do just enough that we can get away with. We're trying to do our best work for Jesus' sake all the time. And for employers, Paul urges fairness, not ruthlessness. All of these encouragements to early Christian believers are rooted in the Christian gospel, but they're also connected to the fact that these early Christians represented Jesus in a complex world. our own work is part of our witness to a watching world. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 11, Paul says, "Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business and to work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders and so that you will not be dependent on anybody." There's a whole load more attitude stuff in chapter 5 and throughout 1 Thessalonians. Now, there are a lot of atheistic writers who in recent years have called into question the origins of Christianity in order to pour scorn on it. And they say things like Christianity would never have got off the ground if the Emperor Constantine hadn't made Christianity the state religion, and so on. But there are several historians who are revisiting the 1st century period and showing how amazing it actually is that Christianity spread so rapidly in a culture that often brutally persecuted it. The reason it spread is because it worked, and the gospel was attractive to ordinary people, and over decades and over those early centuries, it gradually overcame the brutality of the Roman Empire because believers loved Jesus, they loved one another, they loved their neighbours, and they worked hard. And the reason Constantine tolerated Christianity is because by 300 AD, he couldn't ignore it. It wouldn't have even been on his radar unless it hadn't already gained such grassroots traction. So my point here is that the way we live as Christians in an often messy and complex world is part of our faithful, patient witness for Christ. And just doing our work well and cheerfully is a massive part of that. So I'm well aware that we've had a whistle stop, brief tour kind of overview here. But my point is that God's word is so relevant and timeless in the truth it gives us and the examples and the attitudes it provides us with that can massively shape and transform our attitude towards our work and help us to be good witnesses for Christ wherever God's placed us. Thanks for watching. Join me next time as we look at some of the other 3 resources that I mentioned at the beginning.